Look, I don't think it's me. I'm bringing to light the stories of other people, the scientists who questioned whether this virus might have been subject to laboratory research because of the unusual features in its genetic code. The intelligence officials who were taking this possibility seriously and uncovering evidence. There's also the officials inside the State Department. They were censored. I mean, we think of the US as being so forward leaning on this, but the officials I've interviewed for my book in the State Department, they even met censorship. They had their investigation thwarted as they tried to see the links to a lab leak. This documentary on Sky News on Monday night explores a lot of those issues, the scientific evidence, the censorship that scientists came up with when they were trying to get their work published, and then also, of course, Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, and I asked them what evidence they saw that convinced them that this virus might have leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
It's really interesting because Donald Trump has always been pretty hostile towards China. He was always convinced of this lab leak theory. Joe Biden, not so much, but there was a distinct shift in his tone just after he became president too.
I think this is such an important piece of the story because we saw this issue politicized throughout 2020. You can't underestimate the impact that the US election year had on the discussion about the origins of the virus. It's absurd to us from Australia to think that a disease that has now caused 4.6 million people, that any investigation into its origins was so impacted by the politics of a US election. But that's what happened. And so when Donald Trump came out in mid-April 2020 and said that there is evidence this might have come from a lab, a large part of the media in the US and the Democrats, including Joe Biden, just dismissed this as a conspiracy theory. Of course, that changed when Biden himself got into office. He looked at the same intelligence that Trump and Pompeo had looked at, and he saw that this was a real possibility. He ordered an intelligence review, as you know, back in May. Those findings were handed down just last month, and it showed that both scenarios were equally plausible, that it came from contact with an infected animal or a lab.
Yep, there's been a distinct shift in the political elites, absolutely, in America, but also the media establishment too, which I find really interesting. But, you know, we saw that World Health Organization investigation. It included scientists from Australia. I mean, you know, those scientists admitted that they didn't get to see everything, and there's things that, you know, they just certainly weren't given access to. But they were a little bit apologetic and sympathetic to China, saying, well, they couldn't possibly have shown us this because it was, 12 months ago or the like. But what have you found in your investigations of how difficult it is to get any honesty or access out of China, out of Wuhan?
I think the problem, of course, we know that communist regimes are always going to be very difficult to get information. There's a lack of transparency. But my position is, with the downing of flight MH17 by Russia, the international community was able to hold Russia to account over that. We were able to have a proper inquiry. And yet that still hasn't happened in the case of COVID-19. That World Health Organization inquiry was an absolute joke. When you look into the detail of it, which I was able to do for my book, they only spent 3 hours at the lab. They didn't even ask to see the Wuhan Institute of Virology's virus database that was taken offline on the 12th of September 2019. This database is so important because, remember, this lab has the world's largest collection of coronaviruses in the exact city where this coronavirus emerged, and they were sampling bats from the Yunnan province, which was about a 20-hour drive away. So this lab really is extremely important. The virus might have been a natural one, but it might have been collected by those scientists at the cave in the Yunnan province, brought back to the lab, and then somehow released that way. It also might have been subject to some form of laboratory manipulation, which is what many scientists actually suspect. So it really was important to ask for that virus database, and the World Health Organization, They didn't even ask for it, only spent 3 hours at the lab. It was just a farce of an investigation. They then did a show of hands as to whether they thought, which option was most or least likely. And even Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, he walked away from the findings on the very same day that they were handed down.
Wow, that's really interesting indeed. And the World Health Organization isn't really a known investigative body, and it was pretty slow to declare that we were in the middle of a pandemic as well. So that needs to be kept in mind. Now, I know you're going to keep the best for Monday night when this documentary does go to air, but can you give us a little hint? Is there a lot more to come? How was Donald Trump in your dealings with him?
Yeah, I do cover the ground that we just spoke about in terms of how beholden Tedros and the WHO was to China. Both Pompeo and Trump speak about that. But in my opinion, and as you know, I've been looking into this and reporting on it more closely than I'm sure anyone else would care to for a long time now, since March last year. But there were things that emerged in those interviews, particularly with Trump, that I had never heard before. And that was when I kept pressing him, and I had to ask so many times to get an answer. I kept pressing him on what intelligence did he see that was so convincing to him that this virus came from a lab. And he eventually makes an admission. He says a piece of intelligence that he saw, and it's explosive, Laura. And as I say, it was something I had never heard before. So that, to me, is the biggest revelation in the doco on Monday night.
Oh, that's a good teaser, Sharri. I love it. Very good. Well, thanks so much for your time this morning. I know you've been super busy, and well done. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your support. I appreciate it.